Welcome back, everyone, to the Deep Dive. Today, we're going to kind of rewind the clock a bit, back to 1990. I mean, before, smartphones and social media and even podcasts.
Hmm.
But even without, like, the internet and everything, there was this story that just, like, grabbed the whole nation's attention. The Pamela Smart case.
Yeah, it's a story that people are still talking about today. I mean, I think partly because it was the very first like fully televised murder trial, in the
Yeah.
US. It really kind of set the stage for how much we're fascinated by true crime today, wouldn't you say?
Oh, absolutely. And, it's funny because you sent over this podcast episode, and it really digs deep into this whole case. And I got to say, even though I thought I knew the story, there's so many things I never even thought about before.
Yeah, there's a reason people are still making books and documentaries and even movies about this case. I mean, even after all these years.
Okay, so for anyone who maybe doesn't know the whole story, let's just kind of like set the scene. So we're in Derry, New Hampshire. Picture a small town. I mean, like, violent crime basically never happens there.
Right.
And then one day, this young guy, Greg Smart, is found dead in his condo. And at first, the police think, okay, maybe this was a burglary gone wrong. The place is kind of messed up. Things are missing.
Yeah.
But then, as they start looking into it, some really weird things start popping up.
The podcast you sent over, it points out those weird things right away, right from the start. Like, there's no sign that anyone broke in, there's no sign of a fight, and Greg was shot, execution style. It
Exactly.
just doesn't add up.
No.
Yeah.
And then there's how Pamela's acting, which is just strange from the very beginning. Like, in her first interview with the police, she's totally focused on these missing stereo speakers.
Mm.
Like, that's your biggest worry right now. It's no wonder people started getting suspicious.
It's often those little details, right? They can just unravel a story that someone's trying to tell. And in this case, it wasn't long before someone sent an anonymous tip. And that tip completely changed where the investigation was going. It pointed right at Pamela Smart.
And here's where things get really interesting. So the tip says that Pamela, who was a media director at the local high school, was having an affair
An affair.
with a student, a 16-year-old named Billy Flynn, and that Pamela's intern, this 15-year-old girl named Cecilia Pierce, might know something about it.
So suddenly, this isn't just a random burglary, right?
Yeah.
We've got a possible love triangle, a forbidden romance, and a reason for murder that sounds like it came straight out of a Hollywood movie.
Okay, so let's talk about Pamela and Billy. The podcast describes Pamela as this young, ambitious woman. She wanted to be a news anchor.
Okay.
She was married to Greg, but from what the podcast says, their relationship wasn't exactly perfect.
And that's where the manipulation starts, right? The podcast talks about how Pamela would apparently tell Billy about her problems with Greg. She'd say bad things about him and make Billy feel like she needed him, like he was important.
And don't forget, Billy's only 16. He's got a huge crush on his teacher, and the podcast even says that Pamela used their shared love of Van Halen, of all things, to get even closer to him.
Van Halen.
Like, she even showed him pictures of herself with Eddie Van Halen.
Wow.
It's kind of disturbing when you think about the power difference between them.
It is, and it just shows how complex manipulation can be. How someone can use things that seem totally innocent, like liking the same band, to control someone else, especially a teenager who's easily influenced.
And things went from bad to worse pretty quickly, didn't they?
Yeah.
They started sending each other secret love letters. Billy would spend the night at the condo. And Cecilia, the intern, she became Pamela's, like, confidant.
Oh, wow.
The whole thing's this tangled mess of secrets and lies. It's just waiting to explode.
And explode it did. But before we get to that, I'm curious, what are you thinking so far? Anything surprise you?
I have to admit, even though I knew the general story, hearing all these details, especially at the manipulation, it's really creepy.
Yeah. It just shows you that even in places that seem totally normal, there can be dark secrets hiding just below the surface.
Yeah, it
Yeah.
really is like something from the movies, this whole love triangle and all the secrets.
Yeah.
But in this case, like, real people were involved, and things were about to get even worse.
Right, because it wasn't just the affair that could ruin Pamela's life. The podcast says she was also desperate to get out of her marriage. Like, really desperate.
And that's when things get really dark, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
The podcast suggests that Pamela was afraid of what would happen if she got a divorce. She thought she'd lose everything.
Yeah.
So she starts manipulating Billy, pushing him to do something unthinkable, kill her husband.
And that's where those secret recordings come in. Cecilia, the intern, agrees to wear a wire for the police. And in those recordings, you can hear Pamela say these chilling words.
What does she say?
If you loved me, you would do this.
It's scary to hear her say that, knowing what was going to happen.
Yeah.
It shows how she was using Billy's feelings for her, his need to make her happy, to get what she wanted. And Billy, caught in all this manipulation, he tells his friends, Vance Latime Jr. and Patrick Randall, about it. And they end up helping him with the murder.
Oh, wow.
The podcast goes into a lot of detail about the night of the murder. How Billy and his friends broke into Greg's condo, made him kneel down, and then Billy shot him in the head.
It's tough to hear those details, you know.
Yeah.
It makes you realize how brutal this crime was and how much it hurt Greg's family and friends.
Absolutely. It's just heartbreaking.
Yeah.
And while Pamela might not have actually pulled the trigger herself, the prosecution argued that she was the one who planned it all, that she used Billy and his friends to do her dirty work.
And then they decide to televise the trial, which just adds to the whole drama. The whole country is suddenly hooked on this story.
It's crazy to think that this was the first murder trial in the U.S. to be shown on TV. Do you think that affected what happened?
It's hard to say for sure, but it definitely put the case under a microscope, brought a level of public attention that no one had ever seen before. I mean, the media was all over it constantly. And the line between, like, news and entertainment, it just got blurred.
It's really interesting how the podcast explores that part of the case,
Mhm.
the whole media frenzy, and how it might have changed how people saw both Pamela and the crime. It's a question that people are still asking. Did all that media attention mean that Pamela didn't get a fair trial?
Yeah. Did the media, even if they didn't mean to, make up a story that was more about getting attention than about finding the truth? That's a good question.
And then there's the trial itself. You have the prosecution saying Pamela was this cold, calculating person who used her attractiveness to get a teenage boy to kill for her. And then you have the defense trying to poke holes in that story.
Yeah.
They pointed out that there wasn't any physical evidence connecting Pamela to the crime and questioned whether the boys were telling the truth.
Right, like maybe they weren't trustworthy witnesses, maybe they were just trying to save themselves, or maybe they liked the attention they were getting from the media.
It really becomes a battle of who's telling the truth, doesn't it? Two completely different stories, and the jury has to decide who to believe.
And after thinking about it for 13 hours, they made their decision guilty. Pamela was sentenced to life in prison without parole, which was a much harsher sentence than what Billy and the others got.
It's interesting how the podcast points out the differences in their sentences.
Hmm.
Billy, the one who actually shot Greg, got 40 years to life with the chance of parole. The other guys got even less time. They've all been let out of prison by now.
It makes you think about who's really to blame. Who's ultimately responsible in a case like this? Was Pamela really the one who made this happen? Or was she just a young woman who made some really bad choices and ended up being manipulated by these teenagers?
It's complicated, and the podcast doesn't try to pretend it's not. It shows both sides of the argument and lets the listener figure out what they think. You know, it's crazy to think that even after the trial, all the media, the verdict, Pamela Smart's story, it doesn't end there.
It's true. Her life did a total 180. She went from, this young woman with dreams to inmate number 14120 at Bedford Hills.
Bedford Hills.
Yeah, the women's prison in New York.
And even in prison, her story kept making headlines. The podcast mentions that in '96, like only 6 years after she was locked up, she was attacked.
Attacked?
Yeah, by 2 other inmates.
Oh, wow. It just shows you how harsh prison can be, the violence that can happen even in a women's prison. And the details of that attack, they're pretty disturbing.
The podcast said she had some serious injuries, like broken bones and cuts. She even needed a metal plate put in her face.
Wow.
The inmates who attacked her said it was because she snitched on them, but Pamela denied it.
It adds a whole other layer to this already complicated story. And then, as if that wasn't enough, in 2013, those photos came out.
Oh, right. The photos of Pamela in lingerie. They were in the National Enquirer.
Yeah, that was a huge scandal.
I remember that. She said she was forced to do it. She even said that a prison guard raped her and then sold the pictures to make her look bad.
It makes you think about the power dynamics in a place like that, the exploitation, how vulnerable inmates are. It's like even in prison, the abuse and manipulation can continue.
Pamela has always insisted she's innocent. She's filed a bunch of appeals, but none of them have worked. And her case has become like a symbol for people who believe she was wrongly convicted. They say all that media attention meant she couldn't get a fair trial.
It brings up that bigger issue of how the media affects our justice system. Can public opinion really be separated from the search for justice?
And the podcast also points out how Pamela's case, as shocking as it was back then, seems like it was just the beginning.
Hmm.
Sadly, we see this kind of thing happening more and more now with female teachers and inappropriate relationships with their students.
It's a disturbing trend. And while each case is different, Pamela's story is like a warning about abuse, manipulation, and the consequences that can come from those kinds of relationships.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into the Pamela Smart case, we're left with a lot to think about. Was Pamela Smart the mastermind behind her husband's murder? Or was she, like her supporters say, a victim of circumstance?
People are still arguing about that today, more than 30 years later. And I think that's what makes this case so captivating. There are no easy answers. It forces us to look at our own assumptions and biases as we try to understand the complexities of human behavior.
It's a story that stays with you, long after you think you know all the details. It raises questions about guilt, manipulation, justice, about how the media shapes what we believe. And in the end, it leaves us wrestling with this uncomfortable truth. Sometimes it's not so clear who's the victim as who's the villain.
It reminds us that every story has multiple sides, and the truth can be a lot harder to find than we'd like to think.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the Pamela Smart case. We hope you found it insightful, thought-provoking, and yeah, maybe even a little unsettling. If you want to keep talking about it, share your thoughts with us on social media. And don't forget to subscribe to The Deep Dive for more explorations into the stories that shape our world.